I guess this is the third in our Saturday Environmental Justice Symposium event. Today we have with us Fred Tutman, the Patuxent Riverkeeper. Here's his bio. Fred Tutman is a grassroots community advocate for clean water in Maryland's longest and deepest intrastate waterway, and holds the title of Patuxent Riverkeeper, an organization that he founded in 2004. He lives and works on an active farm that has been his family's ancestral home for nearly a century. Fred spent nearly 25 years working as a media producer for international telecommunications, including a long stint working with traditional healers in West Africa and coverage of the Falklands conflict in Argentina on a BBC assignment. So he's super impressive, is the sense you should get from this bio. Fred also teaches and advises in the graduate studies program of Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, as well as at various colleges in Maryland. He's among the longest serving waterkeepers in the Chesapeake Bay region and the sole African-American waterkeeper in the nation. So thank you so much for joining us today, Fred. I will let you take it from here.
Thanks, Cameron. Appreciate that very much. So I'm going to start my screen share just because that's the part that always hangs me up and I want to get it over with so it doesn't make me lose my flow once I really get rolling with this. And I'm going to confess to you, the audience, that this is a little bit of a preview of a course that I'm going to be teaching this summer at Washington School of Law at American University that deals with the ethics of environmental justice. And it's a new topic in some respects, I think, not just for me, but I think it's a topic that hasn't really been unpacked very much. And I must say that I'm a little uncertain about how to convey it. And so you, this group, will be a little bit of my guinea pig on how to unpack about 17 years, actually more than 17 years. I've been a riverkeeper now for 17 years, for what I thought originally was going to be a 5-year journey. I thought 5 years was about as long as I could afford to be a riverkeeper. And then I really kind of fell in love with the work. I became deeply invested in the work. In fact, it wasn't so much that I needed to feel as though I was going to save this river all by myself. I never thought that in my lifetime. The more people made clear to me that my work didn't matter or couldn't be done or was impractical, the more I became invested in not failing at it. And the more I became invested in planting seeds in a watershed that had a long history of activism to make sure that that work continued after I'm done, after I'm gone, after I'm no longer able to do this work, or after there's a new riverkeeper. So along the way, I began to learn more about how the environmental movement, environmental cause movement in America works. And there are some issues there that make this work especially difficult and challenging, I think, for people of color. I think Cameron pointed out that at the moment I'm the only African-American waterkeeper in the nation. The waterkeeper movement is an international movement. We have waterkeepers from many walks in many different countries. In China, in Senegal, and Kenya, we actually have waterkeepers. But in America, African-Americans have come and gone. Actually, I'm not the only person who's ever been a waterkeeper in our particular branded movement, but there have been others before. And I believe that, again, there are some particular challenges that we face and some paradigms that come with the work that may not be apparent to people who don't have the experience of being both African-American and the heritage of struggle when it comes to getting basic entitlements like clean air and clean water and unspoiled land. So the ethics of environmental justice deal with what are the rules of engagement when dealing with fence line communities? What are the ways that we have to function in order to preserve and restore the power imbalance that exists in communities of color when it comes to the environment? We don't all experience or have access to the very same environment. That's really what this talk is about. But it's really the question, the inquiry that I've been engaged in for about 17 years. Where do BIPOC communities, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, just to be clear about what the acronym stands for. And the acronyms, by the way, are often challenging too in this work, like JEDI is one I'll use a lot too. JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. The acronyms will really trip you up. So let me start off by first talking a little bit about small greens, and then I'll talk about bigger greens and how small greens, small conservation, locally accessible grassroots organizations how they differ in terms of the work that they do compared to big greens. Big greens being largely corporate funded, they employ lots of people, they're attractive places for folks to work if you want a green career. And mind you, these are new careers, because I can remember as recently as a couple of decades ago, it was rare to find someone who had a full-time job working on environmental conservation or even activism. In fact, it was a running joke that you had to have a partner or a spouse with a job that had benefits if you wanted to spend your full time working on a conservation issue. We were a movement of volunteers. After Earth Day, I don't know that people had really considered how one could go about actually having a green job, a job where you pursued a vision, of creating a greener world. So let me talk a little bit about how Patuxent Riverkeeper has unpacked this, because it's important to understand the distinction between two different types of work. And the way I'm going to do that is to first leave the Patuxent and leave Maryland and go back to Africa, a place where I've spent some time over the years doing various things. I went on a project many years ago to work with traditional African healers. And there is a point to this that I think you'll find intriguing as it links back to what happens here in Maryland, in America with the environment. So this is a salt mine, literally. They say, if you get sent to the salt mine or the one mine or another. So this is a very, very bad place to work. They harvest industrial and table salt from Lac Rosa of Red Lake. It's a salt lake not too far from Dakar, Senegal. People actually wear these tights, leotards, because the water is so caustic, it's so salty that it actually corrodes your skin. You really can't work in this place in the water for more than a few hours a day. And people work literally for pennies a day. And you can see these boats themselves are not very watertight. They don't need to be, because the water is so salty, it's actually really buoyant. In fact, in the background, you could even see kind of heaping piles of salt in these boats that are actually filled almost to the brim. And so there's a point here that I thought was very compelling. This taught me a lesson. First of all, the way they harvest salt out of this lake is that they go out with these dip nets, these long handles with nets on the end of them, and they scoop the salt up from the bottom of the lake, and they pull it up and they dump it into the boats. And the boats eventually, when they're full, get hauled back to shore. But apparently over the years, as they've taken more salt out of here, the water has gotten deeper. In other words, the difference between where the bottom is and where the surface of the water has gotten deeper. The more salt they harvest, the deeper the water is. So there was an old man of some gravitas, and I knew he was a guy who was important. Maybe he was an elder or chief, but the reason I know he was important was because there was only one shade tree in this really desert and arid place, and he was sitting under it, and nobody challenged his authority to sit under the only shade tree and not share it. So I knew he was a guy who was pretty important. And I spoke with him through a translator, and he explained to me how when he was a boy, they would just walk out and pick up the salt with their hands. They would scoop it up with shovels. They didn't need boats. But over the years, now they have to use these boats because they've taken so much salt out. And I suggested that maybe someday there would be no more salt. But what will they do when they run out of salt? Or worse, what will you do when the water is over your head, when you've taken so much salt out of the lake? And this guy, who was, like I said, pretty ancient, and he cackled through the translator. And, I think he said something like, silly American, what do you know? He looked me in the eye and he said, don't you know there will always be salt? We will never run out of salt. Salt is an inexhaustible thing. There was salt here when I was a boy, and there's plenty of salt here as an old man. We will never run out of salt, and we'll always find some way to get it. And this fascinated me because as a river keeper, I know that this is a point of view that people have about crabs and oysters. In other words, here we have a developing nation with an ethic about the environment that is really no different than the ethic that we have here in America. That this guy not only had no idea of scarcity, he had no idea, even though the writing was on the wall, right? That things had changed so dramatically in his own lifetime in terms of how the maneuvers people had to go through, the conniptions they had to go through to get themselves some salt. And yet he still couldn't quite get the bigger picture, was that this was a resource that eventually would run out. Go a little further south here in Zambia. This is not a natural formation. This is what comes out of the Katana pit, the world's deepest copper mine, in a place where the government has gone into business with the copper exploitation industry. And as they mine the copper, they literally destroy the water supply, the streams and the rivers around them. And because the government is in business with the copper mines, they actually take a percentage of their profits. They want to do nothing that would impair the business of the mines. And so they relocate the towns and communities around the mines. When the water supply goes bad, they simply uproot the entire community, stick them on some parcel of land, goodness knows where, someplace where they have no cultural ties. If you can imagine being ripped from a place where you were born and raised, where your family has history, and stuck in the middle of no place, and someone hands you a shovel and says, dig yourself a well to replace the water that used to be naturally flowing through your neighborhood, you would be pretty stunned. And yet we do versions of that here, which brings us back to the United States. So my ethic about the environment was forged to some degree with some familiarity as a boy traveling in other countries. And I saw scarcity and I saw manipulated marketplaces where essentially poverty and suffering were manufactured by people who had more money. This man is Joe Mills, or was Joe Mills. Joe's passed away from a heart transplant gone bad. But the interesting thing about Joe was that Joe, in some respects, is really me. He came from my neighborhood. Many people in my family knew him. I didn't really meet him until I was a waterkeeper. I was introduced to him by someone at a Sierra Club meeting who said, Joe has an environmental justice problem. You're a Black person, maybe you can help him. Okay, you can see where this is going, right? Put the two people of color together, maybe they can figure out to do something they can do about this Black problem. And Joe's problem was a very interesting one and very tragic one. His family farm had a water supply, a stream running through it. And the stream fed the wetlands, and the wetlands, provided all sorts of local resources in terms of his cattle ranch. But a housing developer expropriated the stream, redirected it, and turned it into a stormwater management pond. This picture is actually shows fire hoses being used to use hydrant water. In other words, tapping fire hydrants nearby in order to flood the field, in order to try and restore the wetlands that once existed there naturally. So Joe once had waterfront property, only to find that the water supply was stolen and moved across the road to serve a housing developer. And various environmental organizations, Big Greens, showed up on his doorstep and started picketing because the reptiles that used to live naturally in the wetlands began to flee the dry, arid place that Joe's farm had become, and went chasing the water on the other side of the road where they would get mowed down on the road by cars. And so there were dead snakes and lizards and various other animals, and whereas the animals followed the water, and the water was no longer at Joe's place. I guess I forgot to mention the name of the farm was Oasis Farm, so this gets worse, right? The oasis is now dry. Then the well water went dry in the house, and the housing developer across the road offered to buy Joe's place at a discount. You can't make this stuff up. It's so mean, it's so brutal. So here we found ourselves at Patuxent Riverkeeper in the middle of Joe Riverkeeper. Now we're trying to save what we can of what Joe's old riparian rights consisted of, right? You see, there's a vague connection to what happened in Africa. Essentially, Joe was in the way. Joe was in the way of an investor who wanted the water supply, and so they took it. And the state and the federal government accepted the warranty from the developer that what was a stream that once was shared by Joe's farm, as well as other downstream neighbors, was actually a ditch. Until the day he died, Joe was mad about that piece of paper that said that the stream that once had fish in it that he had played in as a boy was no more than a ditch. This really infuriated him. And so Joe's reaction was, initially, the only activism he could think of was to build the biggest bonfires he could. He actually owned a bunch of cranes and heavy moving equipment. And he had these steel baskets, which he would fill with logs, and he would light them up with gasoline and logs and haul them up into the sky. And he would light off these bonfires to get the attention of the McMansion people who now were enjoying his former water supply across the road. And I used to imagine that you could go in outer space and you could probably see Joe's bonfire, which basically said, doggone it, I want my water back. This was really something that really consumed him. He really was furious about this. And eventually, the best we could do for Joe, through legal action and through lobbying and through various efforts, we got him 2 solar wells paid for by the developer and a cash settlement because the water had already been sold to somebody else. The water was gone. The water was gone for good. It'll never come back. So you move around the watershed, and let me not forget, this is just, threw this in just because I miss Joe's wise counsel, because Joe was my first environmental justice case. And I learned so much from Joe who would anthropomorphize the animals in his pasture. He could tell you stories about the animals that would connect to the soap opera of human existence. He would watch a couple of cows interacting in the field and he'd say, well, that's just like my two friends so-and-so and such, and could make up all these great stories about them. And so he also taught me how to anthropomorphize animals as a way of better understanding humanity. So this is just Joe sitting by his fire in a time lapse as the smoke rises to the sky, poor Joe. And this spectral image of one of the folks at one of his great bonfires. By the way, if I didn't mention earlier, Joe had a deal with the fire department. Whenever he lit up these bonfires, the fire department would come over for the beer, not to put out the fires, but to watch the things burn. So it was a big prank on the neighbors across the road who thought the sky was on fire, when in fact, it was just Joe trying to have a say about the future of his environment, over which he had lost all control. So all over this watershed in the Patuxent, I work on these issues day in and day out. I work with communities, and the key idea is to restore determinism to these communities. It's not just to solve their problems on their behalf. Actually, it's to give them the tools so that we're planting seeds of activism that will continue beyond our tenure. This was a place where there were activist teachers in Calvert County, Maryland, who were upset that in the winter, these subpar housing places that were being rented for around $1,000 a month by the richest guy in Southern Maryland, literally an industrial owner, right, where the pipes would literally freeze and blow out and flood into the river in the winter. And we had all sorts of complaints about the pollution. Mind you, less than a mile away is the worst coal burning power plant in the state of Maryland that breaks the law just about every single day. This housing code violation that creates an environmental problem is a perfect example of intersectionality. Right? The poverty is part of the problem. If we fix the housing code problem, the pollution problem goes away, but I'll be darned if I'm going to wage war on poor people next to a river, right? People of modest means who have an incidental pollution problem that, yes, is serious, while ignoring this great big coal burning power plant literally across the river. You'll see a picture of it in a minute. You'll see how much wealth is embodied there. And it would be pointless for me to solve the water quality problem here without touching at least the underlying problem of disparity, right? They're connected. There's no way to separate them. And local activism, grassroots activism, accepts that as a paradigm, that all of these problems are actually ultimately connected, and that you cannot separate out the pollution problem from the other problems that exist in the neighborhood. This is the coal burning power plant, literally right across the road. These guys broke the law one year 2,000 times in a single year. The air quality laws that apply to them, never cited once by the state of Maryland. They run a coal waste facility not too far away that is polluting the drinking water 50 times the drinking water standard for cadmium, arsenic, and selenium. Right? They get all kinds of subsidies from both the state and the federal government, not the folks living in mobile home parks right across the river who have a serious water quality problem, some of which is caused by these folks. So you see, there's a lopsided vision here if we're going to work on the symptoms, but not on the problems. And these guys at this plant are known to be a problem because the courts have been telling us that for years. In fact, we've won every lawsuit we filed against these guys. We've successfully, this year, we actually got them to commit to closing the coal burners. The coal burners will close at this particular plant by June of this year. They're finally pulling in their horns and throwing in the towel. We did get some action on the housing problem for the mobile home park, but that was more complicated, and that required much more work, not on the environmental side, but on getting the local jurisdiction to own the problem, to help to resettle people and to put them in housing, you know, so that they can send their kids to school after when they have actually bathed and had water to use. Literally, that was the situation. They were using bottled water because the local water wasn't usable during the winter because the pipes would freeze. And that's what was causing the pollution problem. This woman lives upriver, works in a bar, lives in a home in the floodplain of the Patuxent, left to her by her parents, who are buried on site. Actually, she showed me the headstones. She was being antagonized by guys in black leather jackets working for Howard County, Maryland, insisting that she sign an easement to run a new pipeline, a replacement pipeline, right through her front door, essentially condemning her home, demanding that she sign over an easement for them to run a new pipeline for $5. We got her a lawyer, and the price went to $30,000 the next day. But here's the point, and it's true for Joe, right? The Joe Riverkeeper, as well as for Corinne. These are people so connected to place, so embodied with where they live and where they're from and where their people are buried, that they don't want the money, they want to be left alone. That was the problem. She wanted to be left alone. And so we fought with her for the right to be left alone. I mean, I know it sounds like a simple solution to a complicated problem. The Army Corps of Engineers was advising her to take the $5 and don't get a lawyer, because the lawyer would only antagonize the offer and it would probably go down. How can you get further down from $5 for an easement to ruin your house? But you see, the shocking thing is that here the regulatory agency was literally arguing in favor of her not using her right to a lawyer. The system is broken to the extent that it ignores the problems of the small, the little folks, basically, just like in that African village that had been resettled. The system wasn't really supporting them, it was supporting the investors. So we have the same problems. I'll get to the meat of this in a bit, but you're getting the feel for how the work of Patuxent Riverkeeper redeems hopes and aspirations in this river, not just cleaning up water, not just fighting air quality battles, but also fighting the empowerment battles of these local communities. Work that big greens do not do. Frankly, for the most part, they own the successes. The bigger greens own the successes they work on in these communities and connect these issues to big amorphous issues that aren't really local problems, they're issues. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment too, the difference between an issue and a problem. They're really not the same thing. Here in Lothian, another place in the Patuxent drainage, we have 5 wastewater treatment plants, all within 5 miles of each other. None of them have been filing required federal reporting for a year and a half. 2 of them have raw solids flowing out of them, right? And again, we have mobile home parks associated with them. These are places where health inspectors have told me in the county that they don't go there. They said, because don't you know those people are dangerous. So they don't even, the mandated health inspectors don't even do their jobs, at least some of the time, because of the stigma attached to poverty that suggests that poor people are dangerous. To me, that's shocking. Just as a paradigm, that's a completely shocking idea. We did a health impact study along with the University of Maryland in the same locale several years ago, which identified 22 facilities, some of which didn't even have permits at all. Almost all of them are listed as toxic discharges on the EPA's ECHO database. This is literally a sacrifice zone, a hotspot, where the county and local jurisdictions decide to simply send their unwanted uses. It's a terrible scenario, and it is a classic fence line community, a classic environmental justice problem. And the community really has to uplift itself because the cavalry's not coming. You know, they've had plenty of time. They've had since 1968 when the first of those facilities went in, and things have not only gotten worse subsequently. The town of Eagle Harbor has a population of 69. It is right next door to that coal burning power plant. We've worked closely with the town for several years. We've helped the town do an internal planning process to really decide what the town will look like in terms of its zoning and various allocated uses within the town. We worked with them on sea rise issues. We've helped them find grants in order to fund stream restoration in the middle of the town. What the mayor told me when we first came to Eagle Harbor, he said to me that no environmental organization had ever come to them offering resources. They generally come with people who do not know the community, he said, who essentially want to take something from us, either our signature on a petition or to use our voice in order to leverage some issue they're working on and they're getting paid for. But no one ever came to actually help the town with the problems that the town thought were important. And we, again, have invested ourselves very deeply at the Patuxent Riverkeeper in not just Eagle Harbor, but lots of towns like that around the area. So home stretch here. This is also a study that we worked on, part of a study we worked on with the University of Maryland, where we took a look, an analysis look at where the state public money, not private money, your tax dollars go, if you're a Maryland taxpayer, in terms of restoration investment within the state of Maryland. So we took state supplied data and actually plugged it into mapping software. And what this tells us, and this is part of a published study, anybody who's really interested can write to us at Patuxent Riverkeeper. We'll be glad to share the links for it. But this will just give you kind of an example of some of the data that can be found in the study. So the big dots here show you where the big money goes, and the reddest areas, the darkest, more saturated areas, are where the greatest amount of home ownership is in the state of Maryland. And you notice most of the big dots, almost all the big dots, are where the greatest home ownership is. So you have a much better likelihood if you to get a state-funded restoration project, to get your stream fixed, or to get attention paid to your restoration project if you live in a place where people tend to own their homes. Likewise, on this graphic, same is true, inverted actually, on the poverty side. The big dots mean where the big money has been invested by the state, and the darker, more saturated areas are where the most impoverished zones is. Guess what? The money seems to go mostly to places that aren't especially impoverished. Actually, they go to wealthy areas. In other words, we fix amenities for the wealthy, not so much fixing problems for the poor. All right, last one of these I'll show you in this presentation. Median household income, same issue. Big dots where the incomes are really high, darker areas where the median household income is rather high. Same pattern. And there are about 17 of these on very different ethnic strata, many different filters. So there was a pattern there. And mind you, I'm not suggesting there's some big dark conspiracy in Maryland to make sure that BIPOC communities don't get investment. The point that I'd like to make, based on years of observation, is that these larger movements and the system generally do not find BIPOC communities cognizable. They don't know where they are. They don't know who they are. They're not well informed. They're not culturally competent to work in those communities more often than not. And because there's a presumption that people of color don't care so much about the environment anyhow, then there's very little recognition of what I think is a closer reality, which is that people of color have boycotted some of these movements for years. They recognize that our self-interest does not live within movements where we're an afterthought, where we're no more than diversity, which is, quite frankly, at least from where I sit, something of an insult, right? Diversity does not rise to the level of stakeholderhood. Diversity is not a fair representation of what people of color can bring to these movements that have become very, very focused in recent months over the diversity quotient within. I think what the George Floyd killing murder brought to the world's attention was that racism is extraordinarily prevalent in some parts of the world, in our part of the world. And I think environmental organizations have finally caught on that they don't stand with the racism, which is really not the same as saying we're prepared to change these organizations in order to serve communities of color. Those are really two different sets of values. One says we have no truck with cops murdering people with their knee. The other says we're now interested in going out and engaging with communities of color and getting on their bandwagon, not just trying to recruit some faces that we can put in the big group picture at the end. And I don't mean to make this sound cynical, because I do believe these organizations have the best of intentions. I don't think they necessarily recognize, however, that the paradigms they have used to pursue environmental causes in the past may not work in quite the same way in communities of color. So to express my concerns about this way back in 2012, I actually just wrote kind of a soul-searching letter, which ended up getting published, which in turn ended up getting syndicated around the country. And I just said, look, I'm going to take off the blinders. From now on, I'm going to start looking at these issues through a very different lens. And I'm going to listen more closely than preach, because I'm finding a very different reality in Black and brown communities about the environment than I am in white ones. And the net result from this article was 2 board members quit. And I became completely alienated from the mainstream movement in my region because of the presumption that I was off message, because that movement had decided that the Chesapeake Bay was actually more important than any Black community they knew. In fact, I had at least one attorney who said to me, who cares if these are unfair policies if they're good for the environment anyway? So I do believe that sometimes there's this inadvertence that exists in bigger greens, in funded movements, that because there's been a lack of participation in those same movements by people of color, we're not interested in the environment, and therefore it's fair game. And so they engage in what I call free range environmentalism, where they just go and pick around looking for issues in communities that they can work on, where they can get funded. They expropriate the voice of the community. They speak on behalf of the community. They cut deals on behalf of the community. The view of the environmental universe literally as a marketplace, a place where you can find and transact deals where your issues become commodities for others to exploit. And it really rips off the voice of communities that have intact activism, right? I have many of these groups calling me because I do have a profile, I guess, within the community as a rare person of color who's been at this work for 17 years. And if I had a nickel for every white-run organization that called me and asked if I could help them find a list of Black churches that they can reach out to, the idea being that they can essentially approach the leadership of Black and brown communities in order to co-opt the voice of the community for some climate change issue or some stormwater issue or whatever. And remember earlier I said that the difference between issues and problems is that issues are how funded activists think of their work. In other words, issues are what funders like to fund. So an example of an issue would be stormwater, climate change, flooding, toxics. It's not an expression of a problem, it's a generic expression of a thing we might work on in a general way, because foundation and corporate funders fund along themes, issues. And so they look through these communities for the issues that fund them, not so much for the problems that beleaguer the community. So it's a gap in how these organizations tend to think, particularly with respect to their attempts to bring about these justice and equity and diversity and inclusion conversations. Personally, I don't really care that groups like Sierra Club and others have acknowledged that their founder might have been racist. Everybody knew it anyhow. The real issue is, what are they prepared to do in order to change these organizations so they become much more attractive and appealing for people of color? What are they prepared to do to put skin in the game to see that they're actually serving these communities rather than the other way around? Because the presumption is these are communities that should be supporting their work, that should get onto their bandwagon. They want money, they want donations, they want donors, they want volunteers. Most of the Jedi work that I see occurring in these larger and bigger greens is stymied over the lack of a vision. In fact, I asked the chairman of the board of a national environmental organization recently, what does this organization look like when you've successfully integrated, when you've successfully run your Jedi program? And he said, Fred, I don't know. I just know that funders like that. And mind you, I know that there are lots of organizations that have a better vision than that one, but that one is not an unusual one. So my belief is, in closing, we'll get to questions in a second here, is there are lots of moral and ethical models that one might draw from that would call for any activist or any organization that seeks to engage with any community to at least be held accountable by that community. It is virtually impossible, and I've tried deliberately to avoid naming names, but I'll mention one. Sierra Club is one we've tangled with a lot on this issue because of the presumption that they can interfere in any community's work because there's some science behind them. The idea that if you have good science, you don't have to check with the mayor. You don't have to talk to the community. You don't have to vet your issues with the general community. You can simply slide in there and start taking over the environmental voice. That is not a recipe, right, for grassroots power, that's for sure, but it's also not a recipe for an inclusive movement, right? It's an idea about movements that essentially puts the community on the spot. It doesn't really produce power, and more importantly, it's not a durable movement. So whether you pick the 17 environmental justice principles or any other model, I have yet to find a big green prepared to commit themselves to any ethical model whatsoever if it might restrain their activism, might restrain their ability to go and work on any issue anywhere at any time, which, by the way, is a prerogative that very few people of color have. I could not walk into a white community anywhere in this watershed and immediately assume that because my business card says I'm the riverkeeper, that I'm now going to be in charge of the environment, that I get to tell everyone else how to live, how to recycle, how to do this, how to do that. So it is a tone deafness that exists, that is rampant throughout these larger cause movements, that is absent in smaller grassroots movements. Smaller grassroots movements don't have a diversity problem in the first place, in my experience. Right? Larger funded movements that tend to want to avoid controversy because they must appease wealth have a tendency to confuse behavior change movements with the ones that change the world, which is really not the case. If you really want to have a movement that's going to change the way the water is, you have to be prepared to change the social structure underneath it. Just changing the behavior is a mile wide and inch deep. It's superficial. I had a heckler at a speech I gave a while back, and this guy started shouting from the back of the room, "The revolution will not be funded." That night I went home, had a drink, went online, pulled up, son of a gun, there's actually a book out there called that. It's out of print, but you can find it as a free download. Probably the richest book I have found that talks about alternate business models to apply your activism, because it's an anthology of stories from movements that deliberately, intentionally don't want to be funded by coercive money. They don't want to be funded by Wall Street. They want sustainability by virtue of having the freedom to set their own agenda, independent of top-down control from corporate interests. Foundations are usually corporatized interests, right? Because that's the tax advantage front of corporate America. I'm not saying they do bad work, but I'm saying this is very incomplete work if it does not have the grassroots there to kick it in the butt, to make sure that it keeps it on course, to make sure that it stays accountable to at least somebody. These movements, for the most part, are accountable to the people and groups that fund them, not to the communities that they operate in. That is the point of this talk, really, is that people of color, to be ourselves, to be our own man, to be our own woman, to be our own person in these movements, as they begin to diversify, we have to call them out, right? When it comes to defining who we are. Movements where we cannot be ourselves are not movements that are going to set anybody free, except the people in charge of them. My friend Howard Ernst actually draws a deep distinction between movements that change not much at all and movements that are out there to try and transformatively change the world. They have very different toolboxes available to them. There's very different work they can do. If you confuse one with the other, you'll get lost. You'll completely dither in this work forever. Grassroots movements, historically on my river, are the only ones that have effectively been able to increase water quality. Patuxent Riverkeeper does not receive corporate or foundation backing, yet our litigation and work within the watershed has broken state records. We have pulled $650 million in fines, penalties, reparations, make goods, judicial penalties from various polluters in the river and put it right back into the river. So it's a decolonization process, an idea that's relatively new for me. I never thought about decolonization literally until this year when I started really looking deeply into what would it take to make bigger greens much more responsive to the communities that they serve, and in particular, BIPOC communities, because I do believe these movements badly need the participation of people of color to make them more real, to make them more anchored to the reality of life in America and the problems we face, right? We have a perspective as a people, BIPOC communities do, of struggle as a means towards achieving anything that has been truly important to us. But movements built not so much on struggle, but on protecting privilege are not necessarily prepared to exercise our voice. They don't speak for us. And so they must be clearer about whom they speak for if they expect to have, I think, fair and just participation from communities of color. So let me stop there. I know I've covered a lot of ground, and I hope this has been a little bit interesting, but I guess we'll find out from the questions if there are any. Maybe we can stretch out a little more on some of these points. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. And so what I can do is I can read those out loud and we can just go from there. So the first is from Boris. How can we all assure fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, or income, with respect to the development and enforcement of environmental laws?
Big question. I'll try and make it a small answer. I do believe we have to create safe spaces for people to really clear the air on what's truly important to them environmentally. I've yet to find a community that didn't care about its own environment. And yet I keep hearing these big enviros say, well, you know, those people, they don't really care about the environment. Or worse, you know, we'll just take care of these things for them because they don't get the science. Do you know what I'm saying? They're part of the problem. The idea of portraying people who aren't in the clique, who aren't on the insider environmentalism page is somehow irrelevant to a solution, as though we don't have the capacity to come up with our own ideas and our own solutions. I work a lot with Black mayors, and the stuff they're struggling with is almost always environmental infrastructure that's hard for small Black towns to fund and pay for. So groups that come to the table that don't bring solutions to those funding problems don't really bring solutions at all, actually. So I do think the conversations need to get bigger, and therefore the intellectual diversity gets bigger as well. Who's in the conversation has everything to do with defining the problem. And that also defines what tools we have available to solve those problems. I hope that gets a little bit to your question. There's some problems, I should say, that corporate money won't solve. I guarantee you, you're not going to find a corporate grant to go out and make trouble. Even if it's good trouble. Those grants are impossible to find.
And if that doesn't answer your question, feel free to unmute yourself or to put another question in the chat. But I want to get to your next one. This actually aligns with the question I had. How can we help the current administration in Washington, so that'd be the Biden administration, focus on environmental justice issues like inadequate access to healthy food, poor transportation, air and water pollution, and unsafe homes? And in line with what I was thinking, we know that Biden has appointed a bunch of people who are looking to center environmental justice, from Michael Regan to Deb Haaland. And there was recently an article that said that he has made clear, he made some declaration around environmental justice. What exactly that looks like is unclear, how that works within the current system, or whether they'll actually be able to do anything. Who knows? So curious what your thoughts are there, and how we can push Biden to put his money where his mouth is.
So this administration, I think, has definitely got its ears on with respect to environmental justice. I do think the broader big green community does not have environmental justice in perspective. So we do have to watch very closely to make sure, again, whose voice is being exercised with respect to defining what environmental justice is. Big greens tend to think of it as something they can brand to themselves. Environmental justice really should be inherent in everything we're doing. In other words, if environmental justice is over here, and we got all this other work we're doing, rain barrels and recycling and trash cleanup and all that other, what's that other stuff? Is it the environmental injustice? There needs to be some fusion between the environmental justice ethic, not only of these movements, but also the folks who are speaking on behalf of the environmental voice. And that's who's advising the administration. So it so happens, and I'm sure, Cameron, you know this, the environmental justice community is its own community. And this Biden administration has made some appointments that are fairly significant from some folks who've been around for a while, whom we know. And so we do expect better things from this administration, certainly than we can from the last one. Actually, to be honest with you, we filed a Title VI civil rights complaint in the last administration during the Trump years, and we ended up really going into mediation over it because we knew the Trump administration was never going to investigate an environmental justice complaint. In fact, the agency itself, under past administrations, has a fairly dreary track record of actually investigating those complaints. And so the fastest way for us to get relief for that community, we felt, was probably to negotiate. And eventually we did get at least something that helped the situation, but it was less than perfect because we've had trouble getting the EPA and the government generally to do its job with respect to environmental justice concerns. They're seen as kind of throwaways, something special for the Black folks, something that's a affirmative action, when in fact it's supposed to be inherent. If we're really equal, these should not be little special picky things that we've done just to appease the people of color.
The next question is with regard to decision-making. How can we redistribute decision-making power back to vulnerable communities that are systemically or systematically impacted by environmental racism? So thoughts on the actual redistribution of that power.
And that is exactly what this talk is about. The only work that these communities that you're referring to, I think, really need to be dealing with is the work that restores their power. If they end up getting rid of the toxic dump, but some big green owns the outcome, look what we just did, right? Essentially disempowers the community forever after for speaking with its own voice, for nominating its own problems, for working on its own cause. If these local communities, which have so much richness and so much passion for the environment in them, get overrun by these big greens in their zest to get as much diversity as possible, I assure you those communities will never be heard because their problem will become completely consigned to some vacuous ether up in the sky someplace that belongs to someone else that is tied to this global issue that funds those folks. And again, I know every time I do this, those guys get mad because they say, well, he's against funding, he's against, no, I'm not. I'm against calling something that is not. That's not justice, first of all, right? It's not equity, it's not diversity. It might be inclusion, right? And inclusion is sort of, to some of these groups, looks like, well, you know, the door's open, we're not stopping them. Yeah, they can come on over, they can join. One guy said to me at one of the trail clubs I belong to, I don't care what color they are as long as they can live up to the standards of the club. It's like, well, that's not telling us much. I mean, in other words, if you guys get to decide what the attainments are, we'll decide if we want to measure up. And if we don't, I guess we can hit the road. That's equity too, right? To the point we can, to the extent we can self-define in these movements, then they're truly inclusive. But if we have to be vetted before people allow us to be fully participating members, up until that point, we get to be the diversity children. We get to be standing around being diverse. I mean, again, I'm pouring it on thick here because, again, I'm not trying to create division. I'm trying to make clearer that the charge to these movements after the George Floyd thing is not just to brag about how swell they are, because I assure you, there are plenty of white folks in these clubs who think they're great clubs as they are, even without people of color in them. They're going to have to reach a little further to engage us to the extent they're representative. Then we have real power. Then these are better organizations, frankly. Actually, they have a better story to tell. I guarantee you the story of saving these rivers for the people that depend on them is a much better story than we saved all the crabs and we saved all the oysters, which, by the way, is the prevailing messaging of the Bay movement where I live. Let's save the oysters first. Let's save the crabs. What about the turtles? Yeah, we need to save all those things, but we need to also save the context for the communities that are served by those resources as well. And that's harder to do in big top-down corporate funded movements that essentially want people to feel good about the environment.
I think these last couple questions are really good to end on. I wanted to ask a really quick specific question when you talked about the I guess the investment in communities or the way that it's kind of distributed depending on homeowners or median income. And when you talk about the infusement of wealth into communities, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, if you start investing in all of these programs to bring these things up, that leads to gentrification. People are going to move in, and it doesn't necessarily fit within this system by which Black and Brown communities end up getting displaced as a result of investment. I'm just curious your thoughts when you showed those investment maps, how to combat that the system is likely to push people out if there's investment in some of these communities.
Well, we have to call it out. And to me, the point of those maps is not so much the disparity is being illustrated. That's true, it is. That was why we made the maps. We didn't forecast what the maps would show. We just took the raw data and plugged it into the mapping. The folks at the University of Maryland did that for us. And I think the story that it tells is one that is familiar in America, is that if the environment is a commodity, we all buy the very best environment we can afford. And people who buy really pricey real estate and with waterfront views, they're in a sense protecting the environment through a very different lens than people in areas that have been despoiled and you know, brown fields. Basically, we're protecting green fields rather than brown fields. One of the projects I saw was a $2.5 million project on the waterfront of a river in Maryland, where the woman whose house it was in front of told me that her husband was the deputy director of a federal agency and that she herself had been appointed to a panel by the governor of Maryland to elect where restoration funding should go. So she naturally nominated her front yard. It cleared her view and restored the erosion on her beachfront, and she got $2.5 million. So here's the point of that. I was mad at the time because my little town of Eagle Harbor was trying to get $15,000 to restore the artesian well where the town had been founded. And they got nothing but rejection letters from various Bay institutions saying that there was no nexus between the town's water supply and the Chesapeake Bay. And we can't find any money to help you fix your old well. And the mayor was outraged. He said, it's not an old well, it's a culturally significant well. If they had taken the time to come and visit the community, they would know this is more than just a hole in the ground. This is something very important, kind of like my friend Joe Mills and his ditch. It wasn't a ditch, it was an active stream. It had fish in it. What are they talking about? So this disconnect, this thing where you run these programs by the numbers, right? And you also respond to privilege and perks. Right? I guarantee you, if you're rich, you have a very different idea about where the problems are in your immediate vicinity than if you're dirt poor. Those are very different lenses. There ought to be room for both in these movements. And I'm saying there isn't, and we should proceed cautiously as people of color. We should demand more than just a green job. We should demand a voice, because we have a lot to say about these issues. We're not just newcomers to the environmental movement. We are environmentalists who have gone unrequited and unrecognized. And these movements have to cope with that or admit it and move on. That's really what I'm saying. I'm not going to force myself or any person of color on a movement that really doesn't want us there except to pose in the big group picture. But they take up airspace for movements that really do want to change, that really are trying very hard. And if I haven't said it, there are some out there, some bigger greens that are doing their level best to turn this around. But most will be happy with just sprinkling like a condiment a few people of color, because they've already determined what their mission is. They've already gotten the money for the various issues they're prepared to work on. But it's embarrassing as hell for them to be confused with racist organizations because people of color won't join. They're trying to solve the wrong problem.
So I want to go to Angela's question. I think it touches on Boris's last question of how can we help promote social and environmental justice. But Angela asks, how do you think we can most effectively push the big green organizations to adopt the kind of structural and transformative changes you are discussing? It's been interesting to see shifts in the language from these groups over the past year, and I think many do have good intentions, but have a long way to go. And I wonder about the role that we as environmentalists play in making that change happen.
We have to keep bringing the conversation back to what's just and what's right. We have to represent ourselves and not abdicate our voices into these movements where, again, sometimes we're seen as no more than afterthoughts. We have to help them get to know us better, because I know that some of these movements lack the cultural competence to function adequately in communities of color, and yet don't want to admit it because they've already decided they were the experts. We found that a little bit in the Waterkeeper movement, this idea that if you have an exclusive jurisdiction, because we only have one riverkeeper per river, that to me raises the bar in terms of all the folks you need to be talking to in this watershed to make sure that your voice is a genuine one, not just a loose cannon. And so getting that idea instilled into our movement that has a very good grassroots DNA. Waterkeepers came from the grassroots, and that's where we are today. But our efforts to integrate our own movement have really stumbled over this paradigm that the presumption is that, you know, these are issues that everyone's free to work on, and the ones that obviously have the most resources are the ones who are probably should be leading the rest of us. After all, don't we all want the same thing? I hear that a lot. Oh, we all want the same thing. We all want clean water. So just get in line behind my leadership. After all, I've got more stuff, got more grants, got more this, got more that. That doesn't necessarily follow that the biggest well-funded, right? I mean, the example I've typically used is that social change, activism, is rarely a career, but we have to decide too when we're making a living and when we're making a difference, right? And that Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, any number of activists, Mahatma Gandhi, you name them, these were folks who brought moral change to the world, how people thought about big problems, but they weren't heavily funded because they were change agents. Right? I had a heckler once saying, look what happened to those people. Look how, but the truth is their ideas live on. But the most powerful ideas out there probably are not the ones people are going to offer you a whole lot of money to work on. Corporate money doesn't fund the best ideas. It funds the most expedient idea for their aim. And if their aim is to greenwash, to make people feel good about the environment, to feel good about their brand, right? That's not really quite the same thing as what local communities need and want. And so we need a fusion of those interests to keep those other movements honest, in my view. This is just coming from my experiences as a street activist for 17 years in this movement. Those big greens will eat your lunch for you because they want access to your constituencies. These are movements looking for people to lead. The free range environmentalism, we're picking around looking for the issues that pay us. It's not because we're motivated by money, but because we've accepted the premise that the only issues worth working on are the ones that people are willing to pay for. It's embedded within the values of the organization. That's what people miss. It's embedded.
We have a question from Amina. For college students like myself moving into careers in the environmental justice sphere, what advice do you give for accepting jobs in Big Green versus NGOs or grassroots positions? Do you see more prospect in turnkey changes to Big Green or in smaller orgs? I would like to second that question also.
I have a fondness for small local work where you can make eye contact, where you have a strong sense of partnership with the community. That is work that is time consuming and intensive. It's more than Big Greens can typically do, although some, you know, again, it's hard to paint them all with the same brush. Like I said, some do it better than others. Some use their local canvassing as a basis for making that eye contact. But for the most part, the canvassing doesn't poll the community for what issues they want to work on. Unlike, and that's why I showed you what Patuxent Riverkeeper does. We don't come with an agenda other than our expertise tends to be more towards water. We go to communities and we listen to what's on their mind and ask them if they want a hand with something. And if they say no, we're gone. If they say yes, then we set about trying to find some way of collaborating. And that incidentally does bring, it's not total Boy Scout stuff, it's not Robin Hood. There are resources that come from that. In some instances, we've been able to get co-granting. So in other words, the town got the grant, but they'll pay us for technical expertise, to the extent we can offer it. I mean, we're committed to these towns and these places regardless. But I guess what I'm saying is it's not like it's a total Robin Hood business model. We're looking for opportunities to collaborate where we can plant those seeds and those seeds will bear fruit. And they don't just disappear when the grant disappears. I think that's really the key. Your question was about the prospects for working on environmental justice issues. As I might have mentioned earlier, right now it's following both, I think, guilt. I think it's following money, because I think gradually some money is being made available. Like climate change 10, 12 years ago, people complained to me all the time, nobody's paying for it. Anybody who was doing climate change work in those days completely did it on the hoof. Now, I think we as people of color need to work with our white allies in these organizations that are proceeding on the basis of good faith to help them better understand how to connect with communities on that basis. And that basis is empowering the community at the end of the work. Again, it's durable work. The community won't have to, will have an easier time fighting its own battles going forward. That's the part that I find most important about these big greens that want to expropriate the gains. Because in a sense, they smack down the community's initiative and willingness to fight. The desire is they now have to go and invest themselves in somebody else's decision-making structure in order to find out what our position is on this issue. And so the local wisdom, the local knowledge, the local expertise gets lost. They literally become artifacts, adjunct to these big corporate funded movements. And most people don't look closely at where the money's coming from, because who cares if they're doing good work? And I'm saying they come with a social agenda as well. And the social agenda is part of what needs to be changed in order for us to uplift these very same communities.
So I know we're past time here, but there is one more quick thing, because we have been focusing on communities and I guess community level action, local level action, but the Waterkeeper Alliance, the coalition that you are a part of, is an international organization, like you mentioned. Before this talk started, you mentioned that they had passed a JEDI standard, really exciting movement in terms of centering JEDI within the organization. And I'm just curious what the next steps are with regard to the larger organization surrounding JEDI and this work.
So to be clearer still, the JEDI standard we passed now requires, let me back up a little bit. There have been up until now, until last week, 13 quality standards that govern your license as a waterkeeper. The term is actually a license term, it's a trademark. So you can't call yourself a waterkeeper without being sued if you don't have a license from Waterkeeper to use it. They've registered a number of these trademarks: Coastkeeper, what else? Soundkeeper, Creek Keeper, are all part of the constellation of global waterkeeper titles, essentially. The 14th standard requires that you now have to have, in order to retain your license, a JEDI program, a JEDI plan that's been ratified by your board of directors. In other words, it's something that's really embedded within the organization rather than something that you stuck on the website, like no discrimination here. That would be the least transformative approach, right? Let's just stick up a sign on the door saying everybody's welcome, come on in. Or you can embed it into the culture of the organization, which is really what's the aim, I think, for this new JEDI standard. So it was passed unanimously by the board, and we go through periodic quality standard reviews. And the idea is that if we don't meet the standards, then we get an opportunity to correct the problem. So I would say that the Waterkeeper movement, and again, the burden was high because we are at our basis a grassroots movement. So the standard has to be high for us to be very transparent to the communities that we interact with in these watersheds. And so I'd say the Waterkeeper movement, to give them a shout out, they pretty much set up this JEDI committee. I'm the chair of it. And they didn't tell us what to do. They said, just go to it, do what you got to do. And we have Native Americans on it. We have people from literally many walks. We have international waterkeepers on it, on this committee. So now our job is to help the movement implement this, take it to the bank, make it real, put meat on those bones, right? We were a little nervous about getting it passed because we know it's a culture change in any of these organizations. And if I didn't make it clear, I've spent more than 17 years volunteering for conservation organizations I go all the way back to the 80s with the National Wildlife Federation. If I can name drop, I worked with Kermit the Frog and Eddie Albert back in the 80s at the National Wildlife Federation, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and many, many others. And, at various trail meetings, I've heard people say, oh, if we integrate these trails, we're going to have hoods in the woods. That makes me really mad, right? That within these cultures, within these clubs, within these cliques, these insider groups, there's a perception about who we are as people of color that needs to be corrected. We have to take that in hand. That's on us, and make clear that we will withdraw our participation from organizations who think we're just that footnote. We are much more than diversity. We need to be stakeholders. These issues are way too big to be left to folks who think that white folks all by themselves without our help are going to save the planet. How real does that sound?
Excellent note to end on, I think. Thank you so much again for joining us. Let's do a virtual round of applause.
Give you virtual appreciation.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. Hopefully you can attend some of our other sessions today. But if not, we hope that you enjoyed hearing from Fred Tutman here today. Awesome. I think that's it then.